Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next webinar in our series, Bringing Data to Life. My name is Beth, and I will be your presenter today from the Office for National Statistics. Thank you to everyone who has joined us for today's webinar, Growth by Numbers and Introduction to GDP. So before we start, we'd like to remind you that all of the webinars in this series will be recorded and they will be available on YouTube after the event. The slides and recordings for our previous webinars are also now available on the ONS website, and everyone signed up to this webinar will receive a link once today's recording is available. You'll also receive an email this afternoon with links to any of the tools and articles that we've mentioned during today's event. If you are using the Microsoft Teams app you would like to turn on live captions for this webinar, please just click on the More button across the top of your screen. And for those of you who haven't used this before, it's the button with 3 dots to the left of your camera button. Once you've clicked More, scroll down to Languages and Speech and then select the option to show live captions. The chat function is closed with so many of you on the call, but we will welcome your questions through Slido, and I'll cover this in more detail in just a moment. And the webinar series is for everyone, so please share the recording and slides when they're available and join the conversation on socials using the hashtag statistics for the public good. Lastly, you will be invited to complete a short survey at the end of the webinar, and we'd really welcome your feedback on the webinar series and the statistics we produce. So the session is interactive with some questions for you, and there will be around a 15 to 20-minute Q&A section after the presentations. You can join this by scanning the QR code on your screen now, or by heading over to slido.com and using the code hashtag BDTLGDP. That's BDTLGDP. And if you're using the desktop Microsoft Teams app, you can click the S Slido button at the top of your screen and Slido will appear. And the Slido code will appear on the footer of every slide too, so don't worry if you miss it. So I'm really pleased to welcome our speakers today. We are joined by Niamh Macaulay from the Office for National Statistics, who will tell us what GDP is, how it's measured, what it means to revise GDP and why it's so important. And we're also joined by Professor Mary Sparridge, who is Professor of Practice and the Director of the Fraser of Allander Institute at the University of Strathclyde. And she'll be sharing her insight into how GDP data supports better policy and decision-making in Scotland. So without further ado, I'm really pleased now to hand over to Niamh.
So hi everyone. So I'm going to kick us off with covering what is GDP. So if we go through to the next slide, please. So GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. It measures how much is produced, how much is spent, and how much is earned in the economy over a given period of time. When we measure GDP, we're capturing the pounds million value, so the amount we're spending, but we can adjust this for inflation to get what's called real GDP. And this makes it possible for us to accurately track the actual volume of goods and services an economy is producing. We also seasonally adjust our figures to show a clear picture of the economy's true direction, making it easier to compare economic performance across different time periods. So for example, in December every year we have Christmas, and during this time spending it tends to increase as everyone's going out and buying their Christmas presents. And as this happens regularly, what we do is we adjust this out of our GDP figures so that we can get a truer picture of what's actually going on in the month of December. When we look at GDP, we can look at the pound million value to understand how large our economy actually is, or we can look at the percentage change in GDP across different time periods. Moving on now to look a little bit as to why GDP is important, which is in the next slide. So GDP is widely used measure for most government decisions and for international comparisons. So for example, the government might use GDP data to determine things such as public spending, taxation levels, and overall economic strategy. We might have banks using GDP to monitor growth so that they can use this to set their interest rates and manage things such as the money supply. And different businesses and investors might analyze our GDP figures to forecast future economic conditions, and this can influence their decisions on resource allocation, investments, and strategy. When GDP goes up, this is generally considered a good thing. So it means the economy is doing well, and this can be associated with things such as higher incomes, more plentiful jobs, and higher spending. If GDP goes down, this means the economy is not doing so well, And this can be associated with things such as falling incomes, lower consumption, and a lower standard of living. When GDP declines for 2 consecutive quarters, this is what's called a technical recession. And if we go through to the next slide, one of the ways that we can look at GDP is through the lens of these different sectors. So for example, on this slide, we have the sectoral breakdown of the UK economy in 1948. And this is showing the breakdown of how much we were producing in the agriculture sector, construction production, which will include things such as manufacturing and energy and oil and coal, and the services sector. So we're going to move to our first Slido interaction. So if people could scan the code, or if you've got the app, use your Slido. And if anyone could just have a little bit of a guess of how they think that the structure of our economy might have changed over time looking at these breakdowns. So we'll just give a couple of minutes for that. I can see people typing. Yep, we've got more services. Services again. Yeah, less production, definitely seeing a lot more services. Excellent. I think we can move on to the next slide then, which just shows this here. Yep, so I think most of you have captured this. So yeah, as you can see, so services is now by far the biggest parts of the UK economy. It's the most diverse sector of the economy. So this will include things such as accountants, we've got real estate, we've got bars, restaurants, spending on hotels, and will include things such as education and healthcare as well. And yet people mentioned as well that the production sector, for example, is now a lot less smaller. We're doing a lot less manufacturing and a lot less energy production. And in particular with the agriculture sector, this is now a lot more smaller compared to where we were in 1948. Additionally, we can see that the construction sector is actually pretty similar to where we were back then. Next slide, please. So now just looking a little bit at some of these special events within GDP. So our quarterly GDP data goes back to 1948. So we can observe a number of key events over time and how this has impacted our figures. So here we've got an example of the 2008 to 2009 economic, here we've got an example of the data from 2006 to 2019. This is quarterly growth rates. And one of the key things that we can observe is that in 2008 and 2009, we see the economic downturn. And this is where GDP fell by nearly 6% over these periods. Moving on to 2010, where we had a number of unusual events. So here we had a range of special events which dominated some of the movements within GDP. We had heavy snowfall causing disruption in December 2011. Then in 2010, and then in early 2011, there was an additional bank holiday because of the wedding of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, and this caused an extra bank holiday, and this bank holiday fell soon after Easter, so many people took an opportunity of that extended break, which meant that we had less economic activity happening over these periods. Similarly, in 2010 or in 2012, we had, again, a diamond jubilee, but also very bad weather, so it meant that people had a day off, and so there was less activity. In 2012, we've seen a big impact on economic activity, where we've seen the Olympics. We've seen economic activity increasing quite strongly, driven by areas such as food and beverage industries, accommodation and employment agencies, as well as creative arts and entertainment, as we had quite a lot of tourism from the Olympics and ticket sales. And then similarly, looking towards 2019, where we had our original Brexit deadline, we did see an increase in GDP as businesses were bringing forward activities and building up their stocks ahead of that deadline. Moving on to the impact that the COVID pandemic has had on our figures. So we've got two charts that show both the monthly and quarterly GDP levels, and you can just see the really big impact that the pandemic had on these figures. So in our monthly GDP data set in April 2020, where we had our first lockdown, we've seen our GDP figures fall by nearly 20%, which was a record fall in terms of our time series. And when you look at the quarters, you can see the periods where we recovered from that pandemic shock, which was 2021 quarter 4. So it took that amount of time for us to get back to those normal levels of activity. And these levels of change in GDP have not been seen since ONS measurements began in 1955. So moving on now, we're going to look a little bit about how we actually measure our GDP statistics. So to measure GDP each quarter, we collect thousands of data from companies in the UK. There are three ways to measure GDP. So we have what's called the production approach. So this measures the total value of goods and services produced by the economy during a specific period. We have what's called the expenditure approach. So this measures the total amount of money spent on goods and services. So this will include things such as household spending, which is consumption, business investment, government spending, and net trade, which is exports minus imports. We also have what's called the income approach, and this measures the total income by individuals and businesses. And this includes things such as household income, such as your wages and salaries, as well as business profits. And why do we have those three approaches? Well, these three approaches give us different perspectives on the same economy, and ideally all three approaches should yield the same figure. However, we do use a large number of data sources to measure the economy, and the data we receive to do so builds up over time as it all becomes available. So we can actually have differences in the approaches to measuring GDP in the short run. In terms of our data, as I mentioned, we do collect hundreds of data sources used in the compilation of GDP. And these data sources are all available at different points in time. So for example, we might have some really quick monthly data sources, whereas some data sources could take at least 2 years to receive that up-to-date information. Some examples include the ONS monthly business survey, where we go out and ask businesses about their turnover on a monthly basis. We'll receive data from other government departments, such as Treasury, on information on government spending. We'll receive information from the Bank of England on data on things such as financial services. We'll receive a number of different bits and pieces of administrative information. So for example, we have value-added tax data that we use to complement some of our business surveys, but we'll also receive data from HMRC on things such as business profits, as well as trade in goods, to give us that information on our monthly trade statistics. And just looking at one of our components in a bit more detail. So here's an example of household consumption, some of the data sources that feed in here. So household spending accounts for about 60% of the expenditure approach to measuring GDP. Some of these sources will include surveys that are run by the ONS. So for example, we have the living cost and food surveys, which collects information on what consumers are spending their money on. We'll collect information from areas such as Department for Transport, Transport for London, Office for Rail Responsibility, and this will give us information on what people are spending on different transport methods. We'll receive data from areas such as Ofwat to give us information on what people are spending in terms of household utilities. But as you can see here, it's a really diverse lot of data sources that we use to compile this component of GDP. And this is similar for all the different components that make up our GDP measure. So in terms of our GDP estimates in the UK, we've got all these different data sources which allow us to produce a number of different GDP estimates. So we have the monthly GDP estimates, and this is based on the production approach to measuring GDP only. We don't have any monthly information on expenditure and income, so we've only got our production, or we've only got monthly information on the production approach here. We publish our monthly estimates around 6 weeks after the end of the reference period. So for example, on the 12th of September this week, we'll be publishing our monthly estimates for the July 2025 period. And the UK is actually one of the small number of countries in the world that actually can produce monthly estimates of GDP. And that's because we've got our monthly business survey that underpins most of the production approach. Next up, we've got quarterly GDP, and this is where we've got information on all three approaches to give us a more rounded view of the economy compared with our monthly figures. We publish 2 estimates a quarter, so we publish one around 6 weeks after the end of the reference quarter, and then we update this again around 13 weeks after the end of the reference quarter. So for example, in August, we published our first quarterly estimate of data for Q2 2025. And now at the end of September, we will update this Q2 2025 with new information that we receive from our data sources. We also have what's called our annual GDP, and this is our Blue Book publication. And this is published in July or October each year. It's quite a large publication. We publish around nearly 8,000 data series, and that will include over 260,000 data points. And as part of this publication, we have more detailed sources compared to the monthly and quarterly estimates. So where we have those differences in the three approaches to measuring GDP in the short term, is it part of this publication that we are able to reconcile this data at a really detailed level to get a consistent and integrated view of the entire economy. And as such, all those three approaches now yield the same number, and this is our best measure of GDP. So now we're going to look a little bit about why do we revise our GDP figures. So as I said, in the UK, we're one of the quickest estimates in terms of producing GDP figures of the major economies. It's about around 40 days after the relevant period, but this does create a trade-off. So having those timely estimates of GDP means that policymakers and businesses have those most up-to-date information on the health of the economy to help inform decision making. So for example, having our monthly GDP figures has helped us observe the timing of output around the US tariff announcements, as well as some bringing forward of activity in the housing market ahead of April stamp duty changes. Additionally, when we had the pandemic, we were able to monitor in near real time the availability of this monthly economic activity data. We were able to see the impact that these various lockdowns and policy changes were having on GDP. But having those early estimates of GDP means that we need to trade off some accuracy here, in particular where we don't have complete data, and potentially where the figures could revise as a result of not having all of the information available at the time. So this means that we revise GDP for the following reasons. And apologies, yeah, go back slide. So we will take on some updates to incorporate better or more complete source data. So this can include more accurate reporting by our survey respondents, as well as taking on later or more comprehensive data. So for example, where I mentioned with that HMRC data that we received on business profits, that data, for example, is not available for around 2 years. So it's really important for us that we revise our GDP figures to take on this detailed information when it's available. In addition, we'll look to improve our sources and methods. So for example, we might get a new and better data source that improves our accuracy. So we'll revise our figures to take this on, but also some of the concepts and definitions behind our GDP classifications might be updated. So it's really important that we revise our figures to reflect our ever-changing economy. And we do make very clear in our releases that the figures are estimates, they can be revised, and every year we do conduct detailed analysis to check if there are any bias in our revisions. Okay, so moving on. So we talk quite a lot about how GDP is a great indicator of the health of the economy. It is widely used by decision makers, but it's really important to recognise that GDP doesn't cover everything. So again, we're going to have a little bit of a Slido poll. So if anyone can guess some areas of society that GDP does not tell us about. Yep, so we've got health, charities, happiness, definitely. Happiness, definitely a big one. Voluntary sector, quality of life. Yes, loads. So we can move on then. I think I've got most of the stuff there. So yeah, so here's some of the areas that might be of interest are things such as standard of living and well-being. So as people have said, GDP doesn't directly measure how well people are living or the overall happiness and satisfaction within a country. GDP doesn't capture as well environmental impacts, so we aren't able to factor in things such as environmental damage, for example, carbon emissions or the depletion of natural resources, and this can be costly to society. income inequality that some people have mentioned. So we're not able to offer the insight into how that wealth is distributed within a society. So when we talk about higher GDP, it doesn't necessarily guarantee prosperity for all residents. And yet, as some people have mentioned, there's also unpaid work. So the value of non-market activity, such as unpaid domestic or care work or voluntary work, is excluded from our GDP calculations. And we in the ONS, we do recognise these gaps, and we publish a well which captures lots of other indicators of this kind. So just looking a little bit ahead. So as I mentioned, we do revise our GDP figures to take on up-to-date information as well as improved methods. And in terms of our upcoming changes to GDP, at the end of September, we'll be revising our GDP figures with some updated methods and sources. So the biggest impacts of these changes are research and development. And this is where we've got better data source now to measure research and development activity that's taken place. And what this does is it increases the size of the UK economy. We're also introducing an important change in how we measure the impact of globalization. So these are improvements to how we measure the activities of large multinational companies. So these are companies that have got quite big, lots of different activity happening across the world. So we've done quite a lot of work to understand what activity is actually occurring. And this is really impacted within the manufacturing sector. So it gives us a better idea of what's going on within that sector and how some businesses are operating globally. In addition, looking ahead, we've got what's next, and we've got quite big global changes. So we have international frameworks that guide how we measure GDP. So, for example, we've got the System of National Accounts, which is a manual that's got lots of different definitions, information on concepts, and best practice to how to measure GDP that we follow. And these manuals are updated around every 10 to 15 years, and this is happening right now. So we in the ONS have been really actively engaged in with these changes, but it is particularly important for us as aligning our methods to this updated guidance ensures that we continue to reflect the changes in the UK economy and remain internationally comparable.
Thanks, Steve. Hello everyone. I'm Mary Spowd, and as it says there, I'm the director of the Fraser of Allander Institute. So we are a research institute at the University of Strathclyde, and we're a very large user of ONS's data and outputs on the economy. And we use this data to comment on what's happening in the economy and to try and understand what's going on. And we use this in academic research, but we also use it in speaking to the media, for example. When data comes out, quite often we're called up to explain to journalists, what does this mean about, the success of the economy and how, well off people are feeling. Just to declare as well, I'm also a non-exec director on the UK Statistics Authority, so I'm also involved in ONS through that route as well. But back to my main day job, and if you go on to the next slide, I can just show you a little bit about how we use the numbers that ONS produce to try and understand what's going on in the economy. So this data here is for 2025, so the first 6 months of 2025. As Niamh was saying, the UK is quite unusual in having monthly data, and having this granular data really does help us understand what's happening in the economy in a much more timely basis than having quarterly data. And I will say that it really came into its own during the pandemic, where really trying to understand the impact of that initial March, April and May shutdowns, having that granularity of the monthly data was really powerful. So, you can see here that the growth in 2025 has been a little erratic, and we've have decent growth in February and March. And what we do is we try and link this back when we're talking to the media or others about this data. What's happening in wider economic conditions, what's happening in the world, which might mean that there was stronger growth in February and March. So if we look at February and March, we might think about the sort of global conditions, particularly Trump tariffs. And there was quite strong production activity in February and March, which might be about stockpiling due to the threat of Trump tariffs coming in the months to come. It certainly looks like there was strong production activity. And then if we look at the much weaker growth in April and May of 2025, this might be about the fact that higher taxes, which had been announced by the Chancellor at the budget, came into being, so the higher employer national insurance charges, also things like the higher minimum wage, which did definitely cut into the kind of the margins for businesses in different areas. And there's definitely some evidence that businesses have cut back a little on things like employee expansion plans and these sorts of things. So this is how we can use this data to come up with a narrative about what's going on in the economy and try to link it back to those, those wider conditions that we have in the economy. Importantly, as Niamh says as well, though, these data allow us to understand what's driving growth. So there's this kind of sectoral look. You looked at the sectors of the economy in 1948 to now. So we can understand which sectors are driving it, and then perhaps link it back to, conditions around things like tariffs, which will be linked to that. But we can also look at the other ways of measuring GDP on the income and expenditure approaches. So we can see, for example, on a quarterly basis, if growth has been more driven by consumer spending, or perhaps by business investment, which of these two things are driving growth in the economy, because potentially, that might have quite different consequences for how growth is going to evolve over the course of the year. So if growth is very focused on consumer spending, for example, any issues in consumer credit or household finances might mean that growth is more vulnerable to these sorts of external influences. So really, this richness of data really allows us to understand, what the drivers of growth are, and therefore what might happen to growth, over the next 6 months, year, 5 years time, because that's what we'll get asked quite a lot is, we can look back and see what growth has been, but what does this mean for the prospects for the rest of 2025 and into 2026? And often that's linked to things like, what sort of challenges might the UK government face in setting its budget in the autumn. So that's why this sort of data really allows us to get a feel for economic performance. So we just move on to the next slide, which I think is a Slido poll. So GDP is not the only economic data source that's mentioned in the media or by politicians. So I wanted to get from you, what do you hear being talked about when folks are commenting on the economy? What sort of indicators? Inflation, yes, of course, has been a huge one in the last few years as inflation has hit highs that we've not seen in a long time. Interest rates, employment, yep, absolutely. Jobs, yep. Guilt, yes, guilt has been a big topic of conversation in recent months, particularly looking ahead to the budget. So if we go on to the next slide, then there are lots of different indicators that we can use to understand, and I think it is really important to remember that GDP and GDP growth is only kind of one of those indicators. Despite all the richness you can get from the sectoral point of view or the drivers of growth, it isn't the only thing that tells us something about the economy. We need to think about inflation. How are prices changing in the economy? Because that obviously can squeeze living standards considerably, even if, in theory, the economy is booming. If the labour market looks strong and earnings are strong, that can be a positive indicator in the economy. But if inflation is also very high, then that can eat away at some of the benefits that people are feeling in their everyday lives. And that's definitely what we've seen over the course of 2022 and 2023, that cost of living squeeze. So you need to look at all of these data sets together to really understand the success of an economy. as well as, of course, the other things you talked about earlier around things like happiness and well-being and other things that economic indicators don't always capture. The public finances is another one that was mentioned by some of you in the Slido poll, talking about debt deficits, the cost of government borrowing, so gilt costs, which has been in the news recently. This is also really important for understanding the relative position of the UK in terms of how strong our finances are. So there's how strong our economy is, but our public finances are an important part of understanding to what extent are we seen as a good bet by international markets, and that's some of the jitters that we've seen in recent months, given how indebted the UK currently is, at the moment. Another thing that we might be interested in is measures of inequality, and this can be about things like income or wealth, but measuring the totality of the economy doesn't give you a feel for that. It gives you a feel for maybe how much income a country is generating, perhaps even how much income a country is generating per person. But it doesn't give you a feel for how equally that's spread around and how concentrated that might be in the top 1% or top 0.1% and so on. So there are quite a lot of standard measures of inequality, like the Gini coefficient, that tries to look at how much in terms of income is sort of concentrated in different parts of the income distribution to give sort of internationally comparable measures of income inequality. And then it doesn't tell us much about resource use. As Niamh said, GDP doesn't acknowledge, I suppose, because it's not built to do this, it's not designed to measure this, how much of our growth is being generated by the depletion of natural assets or the extraction of natural assets such as oil and gas. So it doesn't account for that. And there are other measures that are of interest here, of course, as well. So not just how much energy we're using, but to what extent we are domestically producing energy, and to what extent we're in control of production of our energy, if we are threatened in some way. So energy security as well as energy costs have been a big consideration for policymakers in recent years for obvious reasons. Interestingly, though, if we think about GDP, quite often some of these things can be thought of in reference to GDP. I suppose particularly things around the public finances. Quite often, people won't talk about the UK's debt in pounds trillions, which it is. It's a very big pile of debt that we have in the UK. But they'll probably more likely talk about it as a proportion of the economy, a percentage of GDP. And of course, that's not just for the debt. There's things like our defence spending, for example, which is often expressed as a proportion of GDP. And this is so generally so that we can compare ourselves internationally and really understand whether the UK has a high level of indebtedness or has a high level of defence spending, or is it low compared to other countries. That's generally why some of these fiscal numbers, so numbers about public spending, are expressed as a proportion of GDP to get some sort of internationally comparable figure. So if we go on to the next slide, one of the things that it allows us to do, if we look at GDP, particularly per head, per person, it allows us to do regional comparisons about output in different parts of the country. So if we take out London in the southeast, which is the highest, which areas of the country do you think are most likely to have the highest output per person? So it accounts for the population size outside of London in the southeast. Oh, and the results are coming through. Okay, Northwest England, very popular, interesting. So Wales down there at the bottom. Okay, Scotland quite popular too. Oh, Scotland's now in the lead. Okay, excellent. I would say that, I suppose, being Scottish. Lovely. Well, let's see the results then. You were very close to being correct with Scotland and the Northwest fighting it out to be the top region of the UK. So this is GDP per person, as I say, and it allows us to compare across different areas of the country. And one of the striking things, of course, about the UK distribution of economic output, so this is about us, the GDP of each area. You know, we can see that London is a clear outlier. And whilst in other countries this isn't unusual either, quite often the region within which the capital city sits is going to be, you know, kind of by far the most productive area of the country. In the UK, this is much more the case. London is much more of an outlier than, say, other capital cities tend to be. And this is often talked about as perhaps one of the reasons for the kind of productivity puzzle in the UK. Not the only one, but one of them, that our capital city is so far ahead of other areas in terms of the economic output it's generating. And in other countries, it tends to be that sort of second and third cities are closer to the capital city. So it's just interesting to look at these and understand these regional differences in terms of economic output per head. When you're dealing with this data, it's really important to remember two things. One of which is it's about where economic activity takes place, not where people live. And these are quite large regions and nations of the UK. However, you know, there are people who will commute into London, for example, to work, but their economic activity will be counted in London even if they live elsewhere. And that has implications for, you know, where they spend their wages in the economy and that sort of thing. So it's an important thing to bear in mind. And the other thing is to use it in conjunction with other data, as we've already talked about. So if you look at things like household income per head rather than economic activity, then that sort of allows you to understand the extent to which those income measures, which are done on a household basis where you live, contrast with the GDP measures, which are about where you work and where that economic activity is generated. And there's some interesting questions here about you know, working not in traditional office settings anymore, and perhaps working more at home, and where that gets counted in the future. So that's a bit of a measurement headache, potentially for the ONS to come. But this data is used quite a lot to talk in the periphery about productivity. It isn't productivity because what we tend to look at for labour productivity is output per hour or job rather than output per person in the region. But it's a sort of crude measure of productivity and us understanding differences between different regions of the UK. If we go on to the next slide. And just to say, if when we get more complicated about the sort of data that ONS produce and how it is used, some of this data, particularly after that blue book point that Niamh was talking about, where there's screeds and screeds of very detailed data on the economy. It allows us to do very detailed research on different sectors of the economy and really understand supply chains. So one of the key outputs is tables which allow us to see how different companies in different industries purchase things from each other, so that we understand not just how big a sector is or how many people it employs, but how many other sectors it supports through the stuff it buys to be able to carry out its activities. So this allows us to see all of the supply chains rippling through the economy and estimate what are called multiplier effects to understand not just you know, how much activity does the construction sector generate in the economy, but also how much other activity does it support in engineering and manufacturing and so on. So this is really important for us to understand and model economic impacts of different things. You know, importantly, it shows how much of each of the inputs different firms in the construction sector buy, and also to what extent they buy them from UK firms rather than importing them, because obviously if we're buying them from domestic firms, the economic impact is larger. And this data forms the basis of all of this kind of economic modelling. So when you hear maybe individual businesses or sectors in the economy talk about the numbers of jobs they support, or the millions of pounds of GDP that are supported by a particular project or company or sector, then this is the data that is the basis for all of that. And so here's some examples of research that we've done in recent years, one on the aluminium sector in the UK as a whole, another on the impact of university research, and then also the contribution of medical research on the UK economy. These are just some examples of how these data can be used by researchers like us to say interesting things about the impact on the economy of different businesses or sectors. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Just doing a quick mic check. Can you hear me out? Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Genevieve and Mari, for that insight into the work that you do at the ONS and Fraser of Allander Institute. We're now going to move on to our Q&A section, where we'll have time to go through the questions that you've asked throughout the event, and there are quite a few. So we'll be answering questions in popularity order, so please do upvote the ones that you most want answered, and so that we have a balance of questions for both of our speakers, I may also pick some more recent ones. If we don't have time for your question today, you can always get in touch with us at engagement.hub@ons.gov.uk. So on to our questions. So the first one, Mari and Niamh, perhaps if both of you feel free to come in if you feel like there is a question that's relevant for you to answer. But the first one is there an estimate for black market or off the book spending as a percentage of GDP, and is this tracked?
Yeah, so I'm happy to kick us off. So so as we do make a number of exhaustiveness adjustments that are applied in our estimate of the UK annual GDP. So this is an annual process that we do. And this accounts for that economic activity that cannot be measured directly via surveys and admin sources. So it'll include things such as illegal activities, tax evasion, tax avoidance. And as I said, we do that as part of our annual GDP process.
Perfect. Thank you, Niamh. And next question, at local authority level, we use GVA. How is this different to GDP?
I'll take a crack at that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. So this is essentially a prices thing. So GDP includes some taxes that are levied on products, for example, things like VAT. So GDP is at market prices, is what we say. GVA is at basic prices. Although there are different ways of measuring it in between, but essentially it's about the price. So GDP tends to be a little bit bigger than GVA because these taxes on products and subsidies on products are sort of added on, and so it's a sort of different pricing mechanism. Most of the regional data that's produced by ONS now includes this adjustment, so it is GDP data at a local level, but in the past it's tended to be the basic prices. So they're used quite interchangeably. But technically they're just slightly different in terms of the sort of whether they include these taxes like VAT or not. Niamh, is that an acceptable explanation?
Definitely.
Yeah. Thank you both. Okay, so next question, which I think has just jumped up. So from Alex, although nominal GDP continues to grow, has GDP per capita fallen in real terms with recent population growth?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. So so as part of our GDP releases, we measure nominal and we measure real GDP, which accounts for inflation, and we also measure GDP per capita. And what this does is that it takes the level of GDP and it divides it by how many people are in our population across the UK. And yeah, what we have seen recently is some weaker growth in our GDP per capita figures compared to what we're seeing in our real GDP figures as a result of population growth. But it probably is worth noting a little bit that there is some little bit of estimation still involved in this, as we are using some population projections, as we don't have the actual up-to-date figures on the population of the UK yet, particular for 2025. And we do publish within our bulletin a table which will show the GDP change, but also GDP per capita of the UK. And we compare this to other G7 economies as well, so you can see how these are compared across the world.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well, you know, this sort of data is produced for Scotland by the Scottish Government, by the Northern Ireland Government as well for Northern Islands. But interestingly, the Scottish figures, Scotland and the UK over the last couple of years grew quite similarly. But once you account for population growth, which has been much, more concentrated in the southeast of England, you see quite a different story in terms of how much the population, the economy grew. So it has shrunk in a per capita terms for the UK as a whole, but not for Scotland. So it can be quite important when you're trying to understand, whether the economy is growing because we have more people, or is it growing, sort of per person. So it is really important to correct for, so you understand what's going on.
Thank you both. The next question, does the UK have any plans to measure well-being? I believe New Zealand has done this, and I believe the answer is yes, and we have our own well-being dashboard, but I don't know, Niamh, Mary, would you like to come in?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Martin.
sorry. No, Niamh, you go first and I'll add to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so within the ONS we do have our own wellbeing dashboard. It considers the change of around 59 measures of wellbeing grouped by 10 topic areas. So this will include things such as measuring things such as personal well-being. So we look at things such as life satisfaction, we look at happiness. We consider things such as relationships and people's health and life expectancy, different depression or anxiety, looking as well about how we spend our time and people's satisfaction with work. So yes, we do measure it, and we can, I guess, provide a link to the dashboard as part of the accompanying material.
Yeah, really important here to think about what we mean by well-being, because the ONS do measure subjective well-being, as Niamh's mentioned, but generally governments tend to look at a range of measures, which might include things like whether people feel safe in their communities at night, or it might include things like whether they're involved in local politics, if they feel like they have that sort of agency. It can mean a lot to different people, and it can be quite subjective in itself what we mean by well-being, and it can be quite personal to you. So normally it's measured by a range of different indicators. Sometimes people mean happiness when they say well-being, and that's more in the kind of area of subjective well-being, as Niamh's talked about.
Brilliant, thank you both. And just to flag as well, one of our earlier webinars in this series was on well-being, so happy to link that, the recording and the slides, as well as the dashboard, in the email that gets sent out after this. Okay, next question is from Gaz. Is or will CO2 emissions be factored in or compared?
So as part of those international updates that we talked about, so where those international manuals are being updated under the new system of national accounts, one of the big changes is to measure depletion, and this would help capture these type of changes of the impacts as part of what's called net domestic product measure. And within the ONS, we also produce our set of environmental accounts, which will also look to measure things such as emissions. It will look at natural resources as well.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so how far back do revisions go if, for example, some new information became apparent a few years down the line?
So our quarterly GDP statistics go back to 1948 annually and 1955 quarterly. And revisions can actually go back to the start of the time period. For example, if there was a large methods change as part of those international manuals. But more generally, the larger revisions we tend to see in the most recent few years. Those are where we see the biggest revisions, whereas going back over time, we tend to see less revision to GDP as we've got a lot more information.
One example from the last time there was a big international manuals change would be the treatment of research and development spending as kind of capital investment. So it used to be treated just as, just expenditure, but that changed to recognise the fact that it's a valuable investment that you then get value from for more than a year. So that significantly changed the kind of level of GDP all the way back, and that revision was applied by the ONS to the whole time series. And that's just a new way that internationally everyone measures R&D spending. So that's why these things can happen. These decisions about sort of what should be counted as things like capital spending can change over time as economies become more mature.
Okay, thank you very much, both. Our next question is from Mark, and he asks, what work is the ONS doing to adjust GDP for ecological footprint so that if we restarted coal production, its output would be adjusted for ecological damage?
So this is a similar question to earlier, actually. So yeah, as part of the new system of national accounts, it's that change of measure and depletion. So that would capture those types of impacts. So we're actively ongoing work to improve this measurement as part of those international updates.
Thanks, Niamh. Okay, next question. How do end users know what influenced the change in GDP? For example, saying this growth was due to increased production.
So as part of our GDP releases, we'll produce a statistical bulletin, and within that we'll have a number of charts and different tables and some commentary explaining what's actually behind the GDP figures. So there's definitely no point putting out GDP went up and not telling you what drove it. So we like to unpick the drivers and try and get a little bit of an anecdotal story as well, so that end users can really understand what's going on. We also as well, if you follow ONS on social media, we do, as part of the GDP releases, produce an infographic that will show the sectors of the economy that went up and went down. So again, users can hopefully see a very quick high level of what's driving the economy on that particular quarter or month.
I will say the ONS releases for the quarterly or monthly data are really good at doing this, setting out the different contributions to growth. And then even when you say, well, was it due to production, that's digged into a bit further, so you can see what sort of production, what sorts of things are we making that are driving growth, for example. And also, as Niamh says, this sort of acknowledging, for example, bad weather events or good weather events, which can often be more often than you would think. The reason why the economy does very well or very poorly is often the weather. But they're very good at sort of acknowledging these things and saying, it's likely that it could be a part of it. So they are good and they're very accessible to read, I would say.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rove. Nemo has asked, are these figures corrected for inflation? The country has got richer and the population has increased. Taking agriculture, which has dramatically reduced, but has the real value reduced, or is it that other things have just gotten bigger?
Yep. So our GDP figures, we produce them in current price terms, but we do adjust GDP for inflation. So we do take account of basically the impact of change in prices. And that is our headline measure of GDP. So when you see GDP being talked about in the news, it has already been adjusted for inflation.
Perfect. Thank you very much. At what geographical scale can we access GDP data?
Oh, will I go first, Niamh? There are a range of different geographies that that data is made available for. Traditionally, it was done through what were called the NUTS regions or the ITL regions now, which are basically, when you get down to it, sort of local authority level at the lowest level. But ONS have produced data in recent years for lots of different geographies, including local authorities right across all parts of Great Britain, and also in very recent past they've started producing even smaller geographies. Although the smaller the geography you go to, sometimes the less industrial detail you have in terms of sectors in the economy. But basically any geography you can think of, they probably have produced it, and quite often the low-level geographies allow you to kind of build up your own geography if you're interested in particular. But even things like city regions or mayoral regions and that sort of thing, data are now produced at those levels by the ONS. I don't know if there's anyone to add there, Niamh.
Lovely, thank you. Okay, so Charlie has asked, are ONS business surveys used in the GDP calculations mandatory for businesses? Sorry.
Yes, so our monthly business survey is mandatory. It goes out every month to a sample of approximately about 34,000 businesses who will contribute to that survey.
Brilliant, thank you. And from Darren, do you envisage AI having a role in how you analyse GDP data? Perhaps one for both of you, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to kick us off, but yeah, definitely. So as part of our continual improvement, We do regularly look at how best to use new and innovative tools, particularly where we do have quite large data sets, and maybe and looking really to some form of how AI could help us really use that and trying to interpret that data. But of course, we have to be mindful and look closely at those outputs as well. So definitely trying to strike a balance between AI versus the work that we do to sense check all of this data.
Yeah, I mean, you could ask, at any point in the past, would ONS use new technology of kind of any kind to analyze GDP data? And over the years, of course, they will have adopted new technologies to make it a smarter and faster and a more productive way of producing these figures. Also, perhaps, less prone to human kind of error and that sort of thing as well. So there are lots of possibilities, but as Niamh said, an organisation like the ONS will obviously be very careful about introducing these sorts of new tools, but it's definitely got a lot of potential to help us produce data maybe more granularly, maybe faster, and all of these different things. So lots of possibilities.
Thank you both. I think we've got about 4 minutes left, so I'll take 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. Gaz has asked, has levelling up made any difference to the distribution of GDP across the UK regions? Is that something that you can tell?
So, no, it's not obvious from the data that it has. Interestingly, the sorts of projects that were pursued by the UK government under the levelling up agenda, to be honest, in the scale of them, they're pretty small to be able to sort of shift significantly, a region's economic output. But the sort of pattern that I showed you in that slide has been the pattern for many, many years, and hasn't really significantly changed, to be honest. So there's not much evidence at that kind of macro level that there's been a change away from the dominance of London and the southeast in the economy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mary. And our final question from Thomas. Given the limitations of GDP, is there an alternative single measure we could use instead, which is still easy to understand and communicate in a headline to address some of GDP's limitations?
I'm happy to kick us off. Yeah, I mean, that would definitely be ideal. I will say with GDP, it is a really widely used indicator, and one of the biggest benefits of GDP is that it is internationally comparable, and it's really important for decision makers and different policy makers that they're able to compare the health of the UK economy, so that they can use that to inform decisions. So I think personally that when looking at the limitations of GDP, it's really important to consider GDP, but also look at different indicators such as those well-being indicators in addition to GDP. So rather than just look at one indicator, consider a wider range of indicators to try and compile a sort of a wider measure of what's going on in UK.
Yeah, I mean, the issue with GDP is it's good at measuring what it actually measures. But in understanding the health of an economy or a society, you'd also be interested in things like life expectancy or greenhouse gas emissions or even productivity rather than just GDP. So, all of these things are important for us understanding the nature of the economy. But I don't think the answer is an alternative single measure. It's about recognizing that things measure what they measure and not pretending that they measure, something more wide that they're not actually designed to capture.
Excellent. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for everyone who has submitted questions. That is all we have time for today. And just to reiterate, if we didn't get to your question today and you would like an answer, please email us at engagement.hub@ons.gov.uk. Thank you so much, Niamh and Mary, for your thoughtful responses and for your presentations. Before we close, I'd just like to mention that we have a new event, which is now available to register on Eventbrite. The QR code on the screen will take you to our Eventbrite page. And so in October, on the 21st, we'll be exploring the concept of linking data, and we'll be doing a deep dive on how we can link data on health and wealth data to produce richer statistics. And as always, these webinars are free to join and they will be recorded. So before you go, we'd be really grateful if you could share how you found today's event and any suggestions that you have for future webinar topics, and that can all be done on the Slido page that you've been using, where our quick survey will be live. We'll also send you a link to this survey once we finish. So thanks again to Mari, Niamh, everyone who has joined us, and we will see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.